The February light was dying over Oxford.
I
That
am
particular
Inspector,
dying
and I
that
solve
comes
mystery.
early in winter and settles
Welcome
like
to
a
my
grey
new
blessing
case.
on the ancient stones. From his corner table in the Eagle and Child, Inspector Morse watched the last of the day's cyclists clicking past on the wet cobbles of St. Giles, their lamps beginning to pierce the gathering dusk like small, determined prayers. The pub's warmth pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the back a student was reading Don aloud to a girl who laughed at all the wrong places. Morse turned his attention back to the crossword, though his heart wasn't entirely in it. 7 across had been taunting him for the better part of an hour. Scholars' final refuge holds secret shame. 9-6. The clue sat there with the smug patience of all unsolved puzzles, and he found himself thinking, not for the first time, that crosswords were rather like crimes, both built on the assumption that someone, somewhere, knew all the answers. He sipped his bitter and let his gaze drift to the evening paper folded beside his elbow. The Oxford Mail, thin as always on a Tuesday, carried the usual mix of local politics and university news. A planning dispute in Headington, the college boat crews preparing for torpids, and there, tucked between the cricket scores and a small advertisement for piano lessons, a notice that caught his eye with the peculiar magnetism of the understated, sudden death at St. Frideswyde's College. Dr. Lionel Quarles, fellow in medieval literature, found deceased in his rooms Tuesday evening. College authorities report no suspicious circumstances. Dr. Quarles, 54, was a specialist in illuminated manuscripts and medieval ciphers. Funeral arrangements to be announced. Morse read it twice, then folded the paper carefully. There was something in the phrasing that troubled him, not what was said, but what was so deliberately not said. No suspicious circumstances. The phrase sat wrong, like a note played slightly flat in an otherwise perfect chord. In his experience, when people went out of their way to announce that something wasn't suspicious, it usually meant they were working rather hard to convince themselves of that fact. The bells of St. Mary's began their evening peal, and Morse found himself counting the changes automatically, a habit left over from a childhood spent in the shadow of church towers. The sound drifted through the pub's ancient beams and settled into the comfortable murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, the rustle of newspapers being turned by hands that had turned them for decades. It was then that the telephone behind the bar began its insistent summons. Morse watched Mrs. Henderson, the landlady, answer it with the weary efficiency of someone who had fielded 1,000 such calls. Her voice carried clearly enough in the sudden lull between the end of one conversation and the beginning of another. "Inspector Morse." "Yes, he's here. Just a moment." She held the receiver, aloft like a small, black surrender flag. "Inspector." "It's for you." Stranger's voice carried the particular note of a man who had been asked to make a call he didn't quite understand the purpose of. "Morse? Sorry to bother you, but I've had a word from the chief constable. Seems there's been a death at one of the colleges, St. Frideswyde's, and they'd appreciate a courtesy visit. Nothing dramatic, you understand. Just to reassure the college authorities that we're taking proper care." Morse glanced at the folded newspaper. "Dr. Quarles." "That's the one. Natural causes, by all accounts, but you know how these academic types get when there's any sort of irregularity. The warden's been on the phone twice today, wanting to be sure everything's being handled with appropriate discretion." Discretion. Morse tasted the word like wine that might have turned. "And what sort of irregularity requires discretion, sir?" Stranger's sigh carried clearly down the line. "Apparently the poor fellow was found locked in a closet, in his own rooms, door bolted from the inside, key in his hand. Doctor thinks it was his heart. Claustrophobia, panic, that sort of thing. But you know how it is with locked rooms, Morse. Makes people nervous." Morse set down his glass and reached for his coat. Outside, the The evening had settled into that particular Oxford darkness that seemed to rise from the stones themselves, carrying with it the weight of centuries and the whispered promises of secrets yet to be discovered. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, and rang off. As he walked through the narrow streets toward St. Fridswide's, the bells continued their evening song, and Morse found himself thinking about crosswords again, and about the curious fact that the most difficult clues were often the ones that looked simplest on the surface. 7 across remained unsolved in his mind, but somehow he suspected that before this evening was through, he might have found an answer to a puzzle he hadn't even known he was solving. The porter's lodge at St. Fridswide's glowed with warm light, and as Morse approached, he reflected that some refuges, however final, were never quite as secure as they appeared to be. I've always believed that Oxford colleges reveal their true nature not in daylight, when tourists snap photographs of their honey-colored facades, but in the grey hours between afternoon and evening, when the ancient stones seem to exhale the accumulated weight of centuries. St. Fridswide's disclosed itself to Lewis and me in precisely such a moment. Smaller than Christchurch or Magdalen, perhaps, but possessed of that particular dignity that comes from knowing one's place in the world, without needing to announce it. The warden met us at the porter's lodge with the sort of measured courtesy I'd come to recognize in academic circles. Warm enough to suggest genuine concern, distant enough to maintain the necessary boundaries between town and gown. Dame Margaret. Thornfield possessed the kind of intelligence that announced itself quietly through the tilt of her head when listening, the precise way she chose her words. She had been expecting us, she said, though one sensed she would have preferred our visit to remain unnecessary. The college revealed itself as we walked through its modest quadrangle, lawns kept with the obsessive care that only centuries of tradition can inspire, windows glowing amber in the gathering dusk, the faint sound of a piano drifting from somewhere within the residential blocks. Dame Margaret spoke of Doctor Quarles with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to speak of the dead before the shock had properly settled. A brilliant scholar, she told us, devoted to his manuscripts, something of a recluse in recent years, but that was not uncommon among fellows of his particular scholarly temperament. His rooms occupied the ground floor of the oldest part of the college, where the corridors still held the chill of medieval stone, and the floorboards announced every footstep with centuries-old complaints. The study itself struck me immediately as the workspace of a man who lived more comfortably among books than people, volumes stacked on every available surface, papers arranged in systems that would have appeared chaotic to anyone but their creator, the particular smell of old paper and leather bindings that clings to rooms where scholarship is pursued with genuine passion. But it was the contradiction at the heart of the scene that arrested my attention. Dame Margaret's initial account suggested that Dr. Quarles had been found slumped over his desk, apparently having suffered some sort of medical episode while examining a 14th-century illuminated manuscript. The college physician had been summoned immediately, but there had been nothing to be done. A tragic but not entirely unexpected end for a man of his age and scholarly habits. Yet the story the room told was more complex than this simple narrative suggested. Behind the desk, a heavy oak door stood open, the entrance to what appeared to be a small storage closet built into the thickness of the medieval wall. And it was here, Dame Margaret admitted with obvious reluctance, that Dr. Quarles had actually been discovered. Inside the closet, the door bolted from within, a brass key clutched in his lifeless hand. The college physician, Dr. Morrison, had theorized that Quarles had entered the closet to retrieve something, perhaps a book or manuscript, and had been overcome by claustrophobia or panic, leading to the heart attack that killed him. The bolt had been shot in his final moments, a desperate attempt to secure himself that had instead sealed his fate. It was a reasonable explanation, and yet as I stood in that narrow space, studying the peaceful expression on the dead man's face, I found myself troubled by details that refused to align themselves with this tidy conclusion. There was no sign of panic in his features. Quite the opposite, in fact. His hands, apart from the key, were arranged with almost deliberate care. And there was the curious matter of what he had been reading when death found him. The manuscript lay open on his desk to a page that depicted, with the exquisite detail characteristic of medieval illumination, a series of locks and keys. The artistry was remarkable, each mechanism rendered with scientific precision, each decorative flourish serving both aesthetic and instructional purposes. One particular illustration showed a heavy oak door, remarkably similar to the closet's own construction, complete with detailed diagrams of its inner workings. Beside the manuscript, a half-finished Times crossword bore witness to interrupted routine. 7 across remained unsolved. Scholars' final refuge holds secret shame. The irony was not lost on me, though I suspected it had been lost on Dr. Quarles. There was also a letter, unsigned and without salutation, its contents cryptic enough to warrant closer examination away from academic eyes. I slipped it into my coat pocket, noting the quality of the paper, the careful script that spoke of education and deliberation. As we prepared to leave, Dame Margaret mentioned almost casually that Dr. Quarles had been researching the architectural history of the college in recent months, particularly interested in the medieval building techniques employed in the older sections. An unusual focus for a literature fellow, she acknowledged, but scholars often developed unexpected enthusiasms in their later years. Walking back through the quadrangle as the evening settled around us, I found myself thinking about locks and keys, about manuscripts that survived centuries while their readers did not, about the curious human tendency to seek refuge in the very spaces that might become our tombs. Curious reading for a man's final moments, I murmured to Lewis, though I suspected that before this case reached its conclusion, I would discover that some locks are designed not to keep intruders out, but to keep secrets in. Oxford colleges possessed the peculiar ability to transform their inhabitants into characters in an unwritten morality play, each person assigned a role that seems both inevitable and carefully chosen. St. Fredeswide's revealed its dramatis personae to Lewis and me with the measured deliberation of an institution that had spent centuries perfecting the art of managed disclosure. The Porter's Lodge book bore our signatures in careful copper plate, small acts of bureaucratic faith against the larger uncertainties that had brought us there. Dr. Beatrice Lyle received us in the library's hushed sanctuary, where centuries of accumulated learning seemed to press against the leaded windows like a living thing. She possessed those particular librarian's hands that move through air as though turning invisible pages, and when she spoke of Dr. Quarles, her words carried the weight of professional respect tempered by something more personal and considerably less comfortable. Brilliant, she acknowledged, perhaps the finest paleographer of his generation, capable of reading medieval Latin with the fluency most people reserved for morning newspapers. But brilliance, she suggested with the careful phrasing of someone who had navigated decades of academic politics, could manifest itself in ways that were less than entirely collegial. He had been ruthless in his scholarship, she continued, possessed of an unfortunate willingness to pursue truth regardless of the human cost to colleagues whose previous work might be revealed as inadequate. Her gaze drifted to a small iron cabinet secured with an old-fashioned warded lock, its key resting on a ribbon around her neck. The weight of it seemed to settle in that vulnerable hollow between her collarbones as she spoke. When I inquired whether Dr. Quarles had accessed any restricted materials recently, she hesitated in a manner that suggested words were being chosen with particular care. Nothing was missing, she assured me, which I noted was not quite the same as saying nothing had been disturbed. Professor Julian Hartwell, the senior tutor, escorted us along the medieval cloister with the measured pace of someone conducting an examination in weathered stone. His tweed carried the ghost of pipe tobacco like a minor sacrament, and when he spoke of recent tensions with Dr. Quarles, his tone suggested the weary resignation of a man who had spent too many years managing competing academic egos. The deceased had been tearing at foundations, Hartwell observed, with carefully practiced lightness, though the plural form of that phrase did not escape my attention. There had been strong words at recent college meetings about Dr. Quarles's research into the founding charters. Work that threatened to expose what Hartwell termed the elastic nature of medieval benefaction. Some truths, he suggested, were perhaps better left undisturbed, particularly when current fundraising efforts depended upon maintaining certain comfortable historical narratives. On his cuff, I noticed faint pencil marks that had abraded the fabric's nap, and when he gestured toward the college's oldest wall, mentioning priest holes and hidden passages, with the casual air of someone naming extinct birds, I filed away both observations for later consideration. Canon Michael Ashford received us in the chapel, where candle smoke held the ancient stone in delicate suspension. As college chaplain, he moved between academic and ecclesiastical worlds with practiced ease, but when he spoke of Dr. Quarles's recent architectural interests, something in his manner suggested depths that his clerical collar did not entirely contain. The deceased had approached him months earlier, seeking access to building plans and surveys, particularly fascinated by the college's hidden passages and priest holes, those ingenious refuges dating from the Reformation, when Catholic priests required secret routes to safety. Dr. Quarles had seemed almost childlike in his enthusiasm for these architectural mysteries, the chaplain recalled, though he confessed puzzlement about why a literature fellow would develop such passionate interest in medieval construction techniques. His hands, I observed, bore the telltale smudge of brass polish at the knuckles, evidence of intimate familiarity with hinges and keys that seemed somehow significant. Miranda Blackwood awaited us in the senior common room, where leather armchairs had learned the comfortable art of forgiveness. The visiting American scholar claimed to be researching courtly love poetry, though her notebook, briefly glimpsed before she closed it with gentle finality, revealed pages of scattered letters and frequency tallies, the familiar apparatus of cipher work. She insisted she had barely known Dr. Quarles, and that adverb carried more weight than the verb it modified. As she spoke, a curious habit revealed itself. She would quote Chaucer with slight but deliberate alterations, modernizing away the Middle English music and watching to see whether I would protest the corruptions. When April, with her sweet showers, she recited, but the cadence was wrong. The meaning subtly shifted. These were not the mistakes of unfamiliarity, but the careful tests of someone measuring her audience's knowledge. By afternoon's end, each conversation had added layers of complexity rather than clarity. Dr. Lyle's weighted key, Professor Hartwell's penciled cuff, Canon Ashford's brass-stained fingers, Miranda's cipher work. Small details that accumulated like evidence of a conspiracy whose true nature remained tantalizingly obscure. Everyone, it seemed, was protecting something, whether reputation, career, or secrets that ran deeper than mere academic politics. Walking back through the quadrangle as shadows lengthened across ancient stone, I reflected that we had encountered not suspects so much as co-conspirators in a drama whose script had been distributed but never properly rehearsed. The college breathed around us with the quiet persistence of centuries, and I began to suspect that Dr. Quarles had died not because of what he had discovered, but because of what others feared he might reveal. In Oxford, I mused to Lewis, secrets do not hide. They simply hold still until you notice the draft that proves the door is not quite flush with its frame. The unsigned letter had waited in my coat pocket like a patient confidence, its cream-colored paper bearing the particular weight that comes from words chosen with deliberate care. I examined it that evening in my flat, Wagner's Parsifal providing a suitably melancholic accompaniment to what proved to be a document of considerable ingenuity. Rain stitched the quad beyond my window as I traced the elegant script, educated penmanship that spoke of fountain pens and careful instruction in an age when such things mattered. It was the architecture of meaning, beneath the surface, that arrested my attention. The first letter of each line, when read vertically, spelled M-A-R-T-I-C-L, G-A-R-E-T with the precision of a crossword constructor. An acrostic, that most medieval of literary devices, employed here with scholarly playfulness that suggested intimate familiarity with both recipient and tradition. The message itself breathed cryptic menace through carefully modulated phrases. Debts long overdue demanded settlement. Foundations built on sand could not withstand scrutiny, and certain discoveries might prove uncomfortable for all concerned. Lewis arrived the next morning with damp cuffs and a notebook full of reluctant arithmetic. The college bursar, a thin man named Pemberton, whose nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles had accelerated markedly under questioning, had revealed ledgers that told their own story. A substantial anonymous donation had appeared just weeks before Dr. Quarles's death, £50,000 credited to the general endowment with no accompanying documentation beyond a solicitor's letter referring to a benefactor who wished to remain unnamed. More troubling still, the Manuscript Preservation Fund showed a deficit of nearly £30,000, money that should have been ring-fenced for rare books and documents. When pressed, Pemberton had admitted that certain investments had performed poorly, though his explanation carried the hollow ring of a man reciting a story he had practiced but did not entirely believe. Dame Margaret received us in her study where Wood had been taught to behave. Books arranged with mathematical precision, a desk clear of everything but essential papers. She acknowledged the letter immediately, her fingers tracing its edges with the familiarity of repeated handling. Yes, she had received it, though she claimed uncertainty about its author. The accusations it contained were not entirely without foundation, she admitted, with the careful phrasing of someone navigating treacherous waters. Dr. Quarles had indeed been investigating the college's medieval charters, work that had led him into uncomfortable territories regarding certain historical land grants. St. Frideswyde's endowment, like that of many Oxford colleges, rested upon foundations laid when documentation was less rigorous and moral flexibility more common. Dr. Quarles had discovered evidence suggesting that some of the college's founding benefactions derived from property seized during the dissolution of monasteries. Land grants that might not withstand modern legal scrutiny if their provenance were thoroughly examined. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Quarles' research became public, it could trigger investigations that would not only destroy the college's reputation, but potentially invalidate its legal claim to properties worth millions. Current fundraising efforts would collapse entirely. The college might not survive such revelation. Dame Margaret's admission painted a clear picture of motive. She possessed both opportunity, access to all areas at all hours, and desperate need to silence Dr. Quarles before his research could cause irreparable damage. The anonymous donation began to make sense as an attempt to shore up finances before the storm broke, while the missing preservation fund suggested someone had been quietly liquidating assets in preparation for crisis. The red herring swam with decorum. Money, reputation, opportunity. A warden under pressure, a dead scholar inconveniently curious, accounts that sweated in the wrong places. The college could be saved by a single villain, and institutions like to be saved that way. Lewis laid the pieces out with policeable symmetry. She had cause, and the means would follow. Perhaps. Yet the locked closet sat like a refusal. Quarles did not stumble into panic and bar himself in a space that looked like an illustration he had just studied. His face, when I first saw it, was not surprised. Keys tell stories, so do bolts. What I lacked was not motive but mechanism. Letters that line up so neatly rarely tell the whole truth. They point and hope the pointing will suffice. As we left the college, evening mist beginning to rise from the river, I reflected that Dame Margaret had given us a motive wrapped in financial necessity, but I suspected the true foundation of this case lay deeper still in soil that had been disturbed long before Dr. Quarles began his fatal excavations. The manuscript awaited my return like a patient confessor, its vellum pages breathing with the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Dr. Lyle unlocked the special collections room with a key that seemed to understand the weight of what it protected, and the familiar scent of old paper and preservation chemicals settled around us like incense. Rain traced delicate patterns against the library windows, and somewhere in the stacks a radiator whispered its ancient complaints against the February cold. "It was, Doctor," Lyle explained with the particular reverence librarians reserve for their most treasured charges, a 14th-century treatise on architectural mechanisms, locks, keys, and the ingenious methods by which medieval builders concealed their most precious secrets. The manuscript had been misfiled for decades among theological texts, she admitted with professional embarrassment, discovered only recently during a comprehensive reorganization that had revealed several such misplaced treasures. Dr. Quarles had been among the first scholars to examine it properly, and his enthusiasm had been immediate and consuming. Under the library's careful lighting, the illuminations revealed themselves with breathtaking clarity. Each page bloomed with decorative borders that framed technical diagrams of extraordinary precision. Locks rendered in gold leaf that caught the light like captured fire. Keys traced in silver ink that seemed to move in the shifting shadows. The anonymous artist had possessed that particular medieval genius for wedding beauty to instruction, understanding that knowledge, to survive the dark centuries, must seduce as well as inform. But it was one specific illustration that arrested my attention with the quiet force of recognition. The page displayed a heavy oak door, rendered with such precision that I could almost feel the grain beneath my fingertips. The accompanying diagrams showed the door's internal construction, iron rods running through channels carved into the stone itself, counterweights hidden within the wall's thickness, a mechanism that allowed the bolt to be drawn from either side through the operation of concealed levers. To anyone examining the door from within, it would appear securely bolted with no possibility of external manipulation. Yet someone possessing knowledge of the hidden mechanism could operate it from a passage beyond, creating the perfect illusion of an impossible sealed room. The quiet click of understanding settled in my mind like a key finding its proper lock. Dr. Quarles had not simply been researching medieval architecture out of scholarly curiosity. He had been investigating the very method by which his murder would be accomplished. The serene expression I had observed on his face suddenly made terrible sense. He had died not in panic, but in the moment of discovery, perhaps realizing too late that his research had provided someone else with the blueprint for the perfect crime. Dr. Lyle confirmed that doctor. Quarles had been particularly fascinated by this section, spending hours photographing the diagrams and making meticulous notes about construction techniques that might still exist in Oxford's older buildings. He had mentioned that such mechanisms were not merely historical curiosities, but potentially functional elements in colleges, dating from periods when concealment meant survival. The maintenance staff, when Lewis located them in their cluttered workshop beneath the college kitchens, proved surprisingly knowledgeable about St. Fridswide's architectural mysteries. The head groundsman, a weathered man named Hartley, whose hands bore 40 years of accumulated wisdom about stone and timber, confirmed what the manuscript had suggested. The college was indeed honeycombed with hidden passages, some dating from the Reformation when Catholic priests required secret routes to sanctuary. Many of these passages had been sealed for safety reasons, Hartley explained, but several remained accessible to those who understood where to look. Dr. Quarles had approached him repeatedly in recent months, asking detailed questions about the college's hidden ways and requesting access to architectural plans that showed the medieval construction techniques still embedded in the building's bones. As I walked back through corridors that suddenly seemed less familiar, I reflected that medieval craftsmen had built their secrets not merely to hide priests, but to preserve the possibility that dangerous truths might survive even when they could not safely be spoken. Dr. Quarles had died reading about locks and keys, but I suspected he had been killed by someone who understood that the most perilous discoveries are often those we make about the spaces we inhabit daily, never suspecting they might become our tombs. Lewis arrived that grey February morning with the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent hours wrestling numbers into submission. Rain traced delicate calligraphy across the chapel windows as he spread his findings across the vestry table. Bank statements, betting slips, and the apologetic letterhead of a London bookmaker whose accounts told stories their clients preferred, left unread. The figures spoke with a brutal clarity that only arithmetic possesses. Debts that had grown like cancer, payments that exceeded a chaplain's modest stipend by margins that suggested desperation rather than prosperity. We found Canon Ashford in the sanctuary's hushed embrace, polishing a silver chalice with the methodical devotion of someone seeking absolution through repetitive prayer. The chapel breathed around us with accumulated centuries of confession and forgiveness, beeswax and old stone creating that particular atmosphere where secrets feel both inevitable and sacred. When I mentioned the bookmaker's records, his hands, still bearing those telltale brass stains I had noted earlier, trembled with the faint percussion of a man whose careful composure was finally beginning to fracture. He did not attempt denial, which in my experience suggests either innocence or the exhausted relief of someone who has been carrying unbearable weight. The gambling had begun innocuously, he explained, the sort of harmless vice that many clergymen indulge to remind themselves they remain fallibly human. A flutter on cricket matches, modest wagers on horses whose names carried literary associations that amused his scholarly sensibilities. But addiction, like sin, announces itself not with fanfare, but with the gradual erosion of principles once considered immutable. The debts had accumulated with mathematical inevitability. £15,000 to the London firm, money that represented more than half his annual stipend, and considerably more than his savings could accommodate. Professional threats had followed, not the theatrical violence of popular imagination, but the quiet, persistent pressure of people who understood that reputation could be destroyed as efficiently as kneecaps, and with considerably less legal complication. Canon Ashford had chosen what seemed the lesser evil, though it led through territory his ordination had taught him to avoid. Several valuable items had disappeared from the chapel's collection over recent months: silver candlesticks, illuminated psalters, altar cloths whose provenance stretched back centuries. Most significantly, a 14th-century reliquary containing what were purported to be fragments of St. Frideswide's own bones had vanished from the vestry's locked cabinet. Dr. Quarles had been cataloguing these treasures as part of his research into the college's medieval heritage. His meticulous records would have revealed the thefts immediately, Canon Ashford admitted, with the hollow voice of a man confessing to crimes that felt simultaneously inevitable and impossible. Exposure would have meant not only dismissal, but criminal charges, the destruction of a career built over decades of faithful service to an institution he genuinely loved. The chaplain's intimate knowledge of the college's hidden passages provided compelling framework for murder. Years of conducting private tours for major benefactors had given him detailed familiarity with St. Frideswide's architectural secrets, which panels concealed doorways, which seemingly solid walls contained passages, which medieval mechanisms still functioned after centuries of careful maintenance. The method seemed to arrange itself with satisfying precision, access through secret routes, murder accomplished using the very mechanisms Dr. Quarles had been researching, escape through passages known only to privileged few. Lewis thought we had our solution: motive, means, opportunity. The trinity of criminal investigation aligned with mathematical precision. Yet something in Canon Ashford's manner troubled me, a quality I'd learned to trust over years of listening to confessions both sacred and secular. His distress seemed genuine but disproportionate to the crimes he admitted. Theft, certainly, and breach of trust, but hardly offenses that would drive a fundamentally decent man to murder. The solution felt too convenient, like a crossword clue that fits available spaces, but fails to satisfy the deeper logic of the puzzle. Canon Ashford possessed all the necessary elements for guilt, yet his confession carried the weight of smaller sins, the shame of weakness rather than the burden of ultimate transgression. When he misquoted Herbert and then corrected himself with scholarly precision, I recognized the habits of someone whose greatest crime was allowing human frailty to compromise institutional integrity. As evening prayers began and voices rose in ancient harmonies that had comforted generations of troubled souls, I reflected that Canon Ashford was indeed guilty of something worthy of investigation, but perhaps not the crime that had brought us to St. Friedeswide's. His gambling debts provided motive for theft. His fear of exposure might have driven him toward desperate measures, but the serene expression on Dr. Quarles's face suggested death that came not through violence, but through more subtle and calculated malice. The real killer remained hidden, patient as the medieval stones that had witnessed centuries of human weakness and learned to keep their own counsel. The February evening had settled over Oxford with that particular quality of light that transforms even familiar spaces into something approaching the sacred. In the senior common room at St. Friedeswide's, shadows pooled in corners where centuries of scholarly conversation had worn smooth the edges of ambition and disappointment alike. Miranda Blackwood sat beside the dying fire with a notebook closed upon her knee, her fingers tracing its leather binding with the unconscious devotion of someone whose truest life resided in written words rather than spoken ones. The confession, when it arrived, came not through dramatic revelation, but through the quiet exhaustion of someone who had been carrying deception like a physical weight. Courtly love poetry was indeed among her interests, she acknowledged with the careful precision of someone accustomed to academic skepticism, but her true expertise lay in medieval cryptography, the delicate art of reading messages hidden within illuminated manuscripts by scribes who understood that dangerous truths required careful concealment. Her nervous habit of misquoting Chaucer suddenly revealed itself in an entirely different light. When she had spoken of April and his sweet showers, softening the Middle English into modern comfort, she had not been displaying careless scholarship but conducting deliberate tests. She wanted to know if I could hear the change, she admitted with the shy relief of a student whose teacher had proved kinder than expected. I responded almost to the fire itself, one that April with his showers suit. The original music mattered to those who understood that every alteration carried meaning. Her notebook, glimpsed in that moment when she had thought herself unobserved, revealed the familiar apparatus of frequency analysis. Columns of letters with their small penciled tallies, the mathematical scaffolding that supports the breaking of codes. Courtly love, I observed gently, had never required such arithmetic. Dr. Quarles had approached her months earlier, having learned through those academic channels that operate beneath the surface of formal scholarship that she possessed particular expertise in reading texts that concealed secondary meanings. Medieval scribes, she explained with the patient precision of someone accustomed to explaining complex concepts to skeptical colleagues, often embedded dangerous messages within innocent documents using techniques invisible to casual examination. Letter spacing, ink variations, decorative elements that served dual purposes. Their collaboration had yielded discoveries that exceeded even Dr. Quarles' considerable expectations. Several of St. Friedeswide's founding charters contained encrypted passages revealing that the college's establishment had been funded not through legitimate benefaction, but through systematic theft from dissolved monasteries. The hidden text provided detailed accounts of how certain administrators had diverted gold, silver, and valuable manuscripts destined for the Crown's treasury, channeling these resources instead toward establishing an institution that would serve as both monument to their ambition and repository for their crimes. The implications breathed through the room like incense after evening service. If this research became public, it would destroy not only St. Fridswide's reputation, but potentially invalidate the college's legal claim to properties worth millions. Her American university had offered substantial funding for publication, enough to establish her career permanently and provide Dr. Quarles with resources for expanded research. Professional advancement, financial security, and the seductive power of discoveries that would reshape understanding of Oxford's medieval foundations. Yet, like all the others we had interviewed, Miranda could provide no explanation for the locked room's impossibility. The mechanism that had sealed Dr. Quarles within his own closet remained as mysterious to her as to us, and I began to perceive the pattern that had troubled me throughout this investigation. Each suspect possessed compelling motive, yet each also seemed to be protecting someone else, or perhaps protecting the college itself from revelations that would destroy it more completely than any single murder. A small deduction offered itself as we prepared to leave. On the sideboard lay the visitor's register, open to a page where ink had scarcely faded. I had seen her signature there before, against Dr. Quarles's name. Same day, successive lines, dating from a fortnight before his death. "You barely knew him," I observed gently, remembering her earlier claim. "Now you confess partnership." She colored with the quick blood of those who haven't learned to dissemble in a foreign language. "We were careful," she said. "The less people thought, the more work we could accomplish." Walking back through the cloister as darkness settled over ancient stones like a familiar blessing, I reflected that we had uncovered not a single conspiracy, but multiple layers of deception, each protecting different secrets while contributing to the same ultimate tragedy. Everyone at St. Fridswide's, it seemed, stood with their backs against a different door, each one locked, each key deliberately misplaced. The locked room remained inexplicable, but I began to suspect that its solution lay not in mechanical ingenuity, but in the recognition that some secrets are so dangerous they can only be preserved through the careful orchestration of multiple betrayals. The manuscript awaited me in the amber circle of my reading lamp like a patient confessor, its vellum pages breathing with accumulated centuries while Wagner's Parsifal moved through the flat with the measured sorrow of a funeral march. February rain traced delicate calligraphy against the windows, and the burgundy at my elbow had reached that perfect temperature where wine becomes meditation made liquid. It was in such moments, solitude, music, and the gentle alchemy of reflection, that understanding sometimes arrived unbidden, like grace to those who had ceased expecting it. I had been studying the illuminations for hours, allowing my eye to wander among the gold leaf and silver ink that transformed technical instruction into something approaching sacred art. The medieval craftsmen who created these pages possessed that particular genius for wedding beauty to function, understanding that dangerous knowledge, to survive the dark centuries, must seduce as well as instruct. Each lock rendered with devotional precision, each key traced with the care usually reserved for saints or angels. But it was the arrangement itself that began to whisper its secrets as the wine worked its subtle transformation on perception. The decorative borders were not merely ornamental. They formed patterns that repeated with mathematical precision across multiple folios. Letters hidden within foliage, numbers concealed in architectural curves, symbols serving dual purposes as both aesthetic elements and cryptographic keys. The manuscript was itself a cipher, its true message encoded within the very beauty that had preserved it through centuries of casual examination. Lewis had delivered the architectural plans that afternoon, rolled documents from the city planning office that mapped St. Fridswide's evolution from medieval foundation to modern institution. Spread across my sitting room carpet, they revealed the college's hidden anatomy, passages sealed, chambers forgotten, structural elements persisting beneath layers of renovation like archaeological strata. The plans confirmed what the manuscript had begun to suggest. Dr. Quarles's study occupied space that had once served purposes far removed from scholarly contemplation. The breakthrough arrived with that quiet click of recognition that characterizes all genuine discovery. Cross-referencing the manuscript's encoded diagrams with the architectural drawings revealed perfect correspondence. The illuminated mechanisms matched precisely the hidden features embedded in St. Fridzwide's medieval bones. The closet where Dr. Quarles had been found was not storage space at all, but the entrance to a priest hole, one of those ingenious refuges created when Catholic clergy required secret routes to sanctuary and survival. The manuscript provided detailed instructions for operating what its Latin termed the sanctum clausum, the sealed sanctuary. A concealed lever hidden within stonework and accessible only to those who understood its location could draw the bolt from outside while leaving every appearance of internal security. The mechanism was so cleverly designed that even forensic examination would reveal no trace of external manipulation. To anyone discovering the body, the door would appear locked from within, the brass key clutched in death providing perfect evidence of natural causes or tragic accident. Dr. Quarles had decoded this information with the same scholarly precision he brought to all his research, not realizing he was providing someone else with blueprints for the perfect crime. His notes, scattered among the manuscript pages, revealed growing excitement about the discovery's implications for medieval architectural history. He had been planning to incorporate these findings into his research on St. Fridzwide's founding documents, perhaps even to demonstrate the mechanism's operation as part of his academic presentation. The irony struck with the force of revelation. The very knowledge that Dr. Quarles had uncovered with such scholarly enthusiasm had become the instrument of his destruction. Someone else had understood the manuscript's true message and recognized its potential for purposes far removed from historical research. The locked room was not impossible after all. It was simply medieval, employing techniques perfected by craftsmen who understood that the most effective concealment often hides in plain sight. As Wagner's final notes faded into silence and the wine reached its dregs, I reflected that we had been approaching this case with modern assumptions about ancient methods. The killer had not needed to invent an impossible crime, merely to rediscover a medieval one. Dr. Quarles had died reading the instructions for his own murder, and somewhere in the shadows of St. Fridzwide's hidden geography, someone who understood both the manuscript's secrets and the college's architectural mysteries had turned scholarship into assassination with the precision that only intimate knowledge could provide. The question that remained was not how the crime had been accomplished, but who possessed the particular combination of access, understanding, and desperate necessity to transform a 14th-century architectural treatise into a modern murder weapon. After hours, Oxford settles into that deeper quiet, where ancient stones seem to exhale the accumulated breath of centuries. St. Fridzwide's received Lewis and me through the porter's lodge with the conspiratorial silence particular to colleges when their daily performances have ended and only the essential architecture remains. The manuscript's decoded instructions rested in my coat pocket like a medieval treasure map, though what we sought promised to be considerably darker than gold. Dr. Quarles's study breathed with the patient stillness of a room where death had recently called and left its visiting card in forensic powder and police tape. The darkness held its own texture. Furniture settling with the patience of old wood, air perfumed with that clean mixture of vellum and beeswax that clings to spaces where scholarship is pursued with genuine devotion. I spread the architectural plans across the desk, while the manuscript's illuminations arranged themselves in my memory with new and terrible significance. Following the medieval diagrams with archaeological precision, I traced the carved molding that ran along the closet's eastern wall. The Latin had been specific. Count 4 panels from the fireplace, then 3 fingertips' breadth above the chair rail. Medieval instructions, translated into domestic proportion, designed for hands that belonged rather than forced entry. The wood yielded as if sighing at long-delayed recognition, a narrow panel sliding aside with almost ceremonial reluctance to reveal not storage space but the entrance to the college's forgotten anatomy. The passage exhaled centuries. Chalk dust, old damp, the iron scent of time undisturbed. We moved sideways through medieval geometry, our torch revealing worn stones polished smooth by feet that had traveled these routes when discovery meant death and secrecy represented survival itself. The corridor branched with organic logic, connecting spaces throughout the college in ways that official records had long forgotten. Passages led toward the library, others angled toward the chapel, and one significant branch curved unmistakably toward the warden's lodgings with the directness of a planned highway. But it was the mechanism itself that provided the final understanding. From within the passage, following the manuscript's precise instructions, I located what the Latin termed the clavis occulta, the hidden key. A wooden lever so perfectly integrated into the passage wall that it appeared merely decorative, connected through medieval engineering to the bolt beyond. When operated, it drew the bolt silently home, sealing the door from outside while maintaining every appearance of internal security. The genius struck with quiet force. Even forensic examination would reveal no external manipulation. The bolt moved through proper channels. The key remained positioned correctly. The door showed no tampering. To anyone discovering the scene, Dr. Quarles would appear to have locked himself within, whether through panic, accident, or deliberate choice. Lewis murmured that this explained the impossible. I told him the impossible had been perfected centuries before us, by craftsmen who understood that effective concealment often operates in full view of those who lack knowledge to perceive it. The killer had transformed Dr. Quarles' scholarly enthusiasm into the instrument of his destruction, using the very research that had so excited his academic imagination. Standing in that narrow space where medieval secrecy had been repurposed for modern murder, I found myself thinking again of the crossword clue that had troubled me from the beginning. Scholars' final refuge holds secret shame. The answer arrived with the modest satisfaction of the right word sliding into proper crossings. Academic closet. Not brilliant, perhaps, but honest in ways that mattered. As we sealed the passage and restored the study to its innocent appearance, I reflected that we had solved the mystery of method but not yet identified the murderer. The hidden ways were accessible to several people, each with reasons for wishing Dr. Quarles' research permanently unfinished. Yet the particular combination of knowledge, access, and desperate necessity required suggested someone whose connection to both college and secrets ran deeper than casual familiarity. The passage to the warden's lodgings beckoned with uncomfortable implications, and I began to suspect that Dame Margaret Thornfield's involvement in this case extended considerably beyond financial irregularities or institutional preservation. Some refugees, I mused, become prisons when the keys pass into the wrong hands. Truth arrived that February morning, not with the theatrical flourish of revelation, but with the quiet exhaustion of someone who had carried deception like physical weight for decades. Dame Margaret Thornfield received us in her study, where morning light struggled through leaded windows to illuminate a career's worth of careful achievements. Honorary degrees framed in walnut, photographs with dignitaries whose comfortable authority had been earned rather than inherited, books bearing her own scholarship arranged with unconscious pride. She knew, of course, why we had come. The discovery of the hidden passages, the decoded manuscript, the medieval mechanism that had transformed impossibility into method. These revelations had made our conclusion inevitable. When I mentioned the photograph on her mantel, that small image I had missed during previous visits, her composure finally began its careful dissolution. 2 children in Sunday clothes before a red brick vicarage, the boy's jaw already stubborn with principles that would later drive him to change his name. The girl's gaze meeting the camera with the directness of someone who understood that questions would eventually require answers. The brass frame bore an inscription just visible in the morning light. T. Parish Fate, 1959. Thornfield. I had read it twice, as I had read the unsigned letter, and heard in that repetition the quiet percussion of certainty. "He was your brother," I said, using the gentlest grammar possible, and she closed her eyes, not in denial, but to reduce the world to something she could bear to hold. Lionel had once been a Lionel Thornfield, she confirmed, until his principles proved stronger than his patience for family loyalty. Their father, the Reverend Canon Thornfield, had served as vicar of a prosperous Cotswolds parish, where his reputation for financial acumen had made him trusted custodian of church funds, school endowments, and charitable bequests representing centuries of accumulated faith in clerical integrity. The embezzlement had been discovered only after his death. Systematic theft extending back nearly a decade, thousands of pounds diverted from restoration funds, memorial donations redirected toward investments that supported the comfortable lifestyle befitting his position. Margaret had spent 20 years constructing elaborate defenses against discovery, building her academic career on foundations she knew to be compromised, each promotion carrying the weight of knowledge that exposure would destroy not only her position, but her very identity as someone worthy of respect. Lionel's research into St. Friedeswide's medieval corruption had triggered precisely the sort of investigation she had spent decades avoiding. His scholarly enthusiasm for exposing historical fraud would inevitably lead to broader examinations of ecclesiastical financial practices, reviews that might uncover their father's crimes and reveal the careful deceptions she had maintained to protect both their reputations. The murder had been planned with the same meticulous attention that characterized her scholarly work. She had approached him under the pretense of family reconciliation, suggesting they meet privately to discuss their father's legacy. The wine had been treated with digitalis, easily obtainable from the college gardens, virtually undetectable in small doses, capable of inducing the heart failure that would provide perfect cover for death from natural causes. She had lured him to his study with promises of documents that might resolve their family troubles, then watched him succumb to the poison's effects while he read about medieval locks and keys, the irony not lost on either of them. From the hidden passage, she had activated the mechanism that sealed the door from outside while maintaining every appearance of internal security. I asked whether she regretted it, and she answered with a pause in which I heard the faintest movement of bells beyond the morning rain. "Regret implies the presence of an alternative," she said quietly. I never possessed one. As we prepared to leave, Dame Margaret remained seated at her desk, surrounded by the careful achievements that had become both fortress and prison. She had killed her brother not from hatred, but from the desperate need to preserve a fiction that had become her only reality. The medieval mechanism had served its purpose perfectly, but like all perfect crimes, it had required the destruction of the criminal's own humanity to accomplish its ends. Walking back through the quadrangle where puddles held imperfect copies of ancient windows, I reflected that some refugees become tombs when the keys pass into hands that have forgotten how to unlock rather than seal. Confession arrived not with the theatrical crash of revelation, but through the quiet erosion of defenses that had held for decades, like ancient mortar finally yielding to time's patient pressure. Dame Margaret Thornfield sat in her study chair with the particular stillness of someone who had stopped running from a truth that refused to remain buried. Morning light filtered through leaded windows, illuminating dust motes that danced with ceremonial solemnity above achievements that now seemed as fragile as manuscript illumination. She did not attempt denial when I laid out the methodical reconstruction, the family photograph revealing their relationship, the digitalis growing abundantly in the college gardens, the medieval mechanism that had transformed scholarly enthusiasm into murder weapon. Instead, she nodded with weary recognition. Her hands folded like prayer books closed after final service. The words, when they came, carried decades of carefully maintained fiction. She spoke of family as one might discuss a chronic illness, of duty to institutions that had shaped her identity more completely than blood or faith. Her father's embezzlement had created gravitational fields of shame that pulled both children into orbits of deception, though only Lionel had possessed the moral courage to seek escape through truth rather than concealment. She had hoped for something clean and final, natural causes, perhaps suicide born of academic despair. Lionel's dangerous research into St. Frideswide's fraudulent charters would die with him, and her carefully constructed respectability could continue protecting them both from their father's legacy. The Digitalis had been chosen for its subtle efficiency. The medieval manuscript meant to disappear back into archival obscurity, where it had rested undisturbed for decades. But Lionel had died clutching the illuminated pages, forcing her to leave them as evidence of his final scholarly pursuit. The irony struck with quiet force. His greatest discovery, those medieval techniques that had so excited his imagination, had become the blueprint for his own murder. She had turned his research against him with the same methodical precision he brought to paleography. A small deduction offered itself as we prepared for her arrest. The sleeve of her coat bore a bloom of red dust where the binding of medieval manuscripts sheds its tired pigment. Cinnabar, the preservation staff called it, treating such stains with ridiculous tenderness. People who claimed never to enter the stacks alone, as she had insisted during our first meeting, seldom wore their scholarly history so visibly on their cuffs. Lewis supervised her departure with quiet efficiency as she walked past framed degrees and photographs of dignitaries, maintaining dignity that was both chilling and profoundly sad. Not the dignity of innocence, but the stoic resignation of someone finally laying down an unbearable burden. The college would survive, as such institutions always do. St. Frideswide's had weathered centuries of human frailty and learned the institutional art of absorbing individual tragedy while maintaining collective continuity. There would be discreet settlements, careful management of publicity, quiet resignations that would ensure the essential work continued, while peripheral drama faded into footnotes future scholars might discover but rarely understand. Yet the human cost weighed heavily as I walked through the quadrangle where February light struggled through promising rain clouds. Two siblings destroyed by their father's sins, a brilliant scholar dead at 54, a distinguished career ending in handcuffs and headlines. The medieval manuscript would return to proper archival placement, its secrets safely catalogued for researchers who would never suspect how closely those illuminated diagrams had approached modern murder. As afternoon settled toward evening, I reflected that the most dangerous keys are often those we forge ourselves from materials of family shame and institutional loyalty. Some locks are designed not to keep intruders out, but to preserve secrets within, and the finest discoveries are sometimes indistinguishable from the instruments that destroy us. Weeks later, I walked alone through St. Frideswide's quadrangle in the pearl-grey light of early morning, when shadows still held the night's secrets and the honey-colored stone breathed with centuries of accumulated wisdom. The college had settled back into its ancient rhythms with the institutional memory of walls that had witnessed human frailty for generations and learned to outlast it all. Frost traced delicate calligraphy across the lawns, and somewhere in the distance, a groundsman's broom whispered against flagstones with the patience of someone who understood that order was always temporary. The various scandals had been managed with the discretion that only Oxford institutions possess. The financial irregularities had been reclassified as accounting discrepancies, explained away through careful memoranda that transformed crisis into footnote. Canon Ashford's stolen chapel items had been quietly returned through channels that preserved both his positions and the college's reputation, their absence now attributed to misplaced inventory records rather than desperate theft. The dangerous research into St. Frideswide's fraudulent medieval charters had been transferred to an academic committee where it would undergo scholarly review. the sort that typically extends for decades without reaching uncomfortable conclusions. Lewis found me by the porter's lodge, carrying the particular satisfaction of a man whose world still conformed to the reliable geometry of cases closed and justice served. "Another one wrapped up neatly," he observed, speaking of Dame Margaret's confession and the efficiency of legal proceedings. The chief was pleased. Strange had drafted the commendation, and the newspapers would treat it as a private tragedy rather than institutional scandal. I nodded with agreement I didn't entirely feel. The medieval manuscript now rested in proper archival custody, its deadly secrets catalogued with scholarly precision by researchers who would never understand how closely those illuminated diagrams had approached modern murder. The Sanctum Clausum would sleep again among theological texts, its mechanisms known only to a few who would never comprehend their true significance. The bells of Oxford began their morning call. Christ Church, St. Mary's, Magdalen adding their voices to the ancient conversation that marks time's passage over dreaming spires. I thought of Dr. Quarles, whose curiosity had exceeded his caution, and of Dame Margaret, who had mistaken endurance for virtue and been destroyed by both. The crossword that had troubled me that first evening finally yielded its answer. Academic closet. Not elegant, perhaps, but honest in ways that mattered. A small observation offered itself as we prepared to leave. In the porter's lodge, the visitor's register lay open to recent entries, and I noticed that 2 signatures had been carefully rewritten in different ink. Times adjusted, names rendered with confidence no one had felt. The page bore the faint smell of correction fluid, evidence of institutional memory being gently edited for posterity. Lewis spoke of completion, but I found myself thinking of locks and keys, of the curious human tendency to forge our own chains from materials we mistake for protection. The most dangerous mysteries are often those we create for ourselves, built not from external threats, but from the accumulated weight of choices that seemed reasonable at the time, yet prove, in retrospect, to have been the careful construction of our own prisons. I left through St. Frideswide's ancient gate, the heavy oak closing behind me with a sigh that seemed to carry both resignation and enduring mystery. The morning stretched ahead with its promise of ordinary concerns, but I carried with me the knowledge that some locks are designed not to keep intruders out, but to preserve secrets within, and that the price of truth is sometimes higher than the cost of lies. A burden we are expected to bear with the same quiet dignity that these ancient stones have shown for centuries.